Okay, I think it started. Mhm. Yes. So, I think we can start with a brief introduction about the War Legacies projects and the experience that you've had in advocating or the legal actions related to Agent Orange.
Okay. So I found projects in 2007. I mean, it's a little hard to say because I've been working on this issue for since the late 1990s. And I was working with another organization called the Fund for Reconciliation and Development, and that was an organization based in New York. And then so I had already been working on what the project within that organization was called the War Legacies Project.
Mm.
And then when that organization began to only focus on Cuba, I took all of my work and officially founded the War Legacies Project as its own independent organization. So it's got a kind of a long history. But I've been working on this Agent Orange issue really in almost entirely for most of my work since probably 1999 2000, around that time frame, when I had been a lot of my work before. I was working on people-to-people exchanges between Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, and the US, and trying to normalize relations between our country and the three countries that were impacted by the war. And when all of that happened and the normalization occurred, and there was a lot of other avenues for people to travel back and forth, I began to focus exclusively on the war legacy issues, and more specifically on Agent Orange. And beginning originally with um, trying to raise awareness about the impact Agent Orange has had in Vietnam, and raising funds for victim assistance. So I cooperated at that point with the Vietnam Red Cross, who had set up the Vietnam Agent Orange um, Fund, I think it was called. And that was with a doctor called Dr. Lê Cao Dai, who was one of the Vietnamese who really spent a lot, I would say the last, probably, well, since the war, so probably the last 40 years of his life, advocating for support to families who had children with severe disabilities in Vietnam that were believed to be caused by Agent Orange, and advocating for the US government to post normalization of relations to do something about it, because they believed, Dr. Lê Cao Dai and his other Vietnamese colleagues believed that the US was morally responsible, at the very least, if not legally responsible for the impacts. So after meeting Dr. Lê Cao Dai in the probably mid to late 90s, I really became very involved in helping my Vietnamese counterparts at the Vietnam Red Cross to begin to raise awareness about this space funds. And then in 2004, when the Vietnam Association of Victims of Agent Orange filed their lawsuit against the chemical companies, Dow and Monsanto, and the others in US courts, there became a huge international attention. I'm sure if you've done your research, you've seen that there's a lot of attention to the issue at that point, as the lawsuit received attention here in the United States, in Europe, in Vietnam, of course. And I began to spend a lot of time working with various journalists and photographers and filmmakers to connect them to people in Vietnam who had been impacted by Agent Orange, and connecting them with the Vietnamese organizations and individuals who had been advocating on this issue there. So that was kind of how I started to get really deeply involved in this issue. I should start also to say that my father was a Vietnam veteran who had served 2 tours in Vietnam, and he had Parkinson's disease, which was associated with exposure to Agent Orange. So there was a very personal reason as well for me to want to work on this issue, not just because I was very involved with working in Vietnam. Then as I said, in 2000, about 2006, 2007, I left my other organization and moved back home to Vermont to found the War Legacies Project and began to work full time on this issue. And at that point, also, I received a call from um, at that point, the wife of a Vietnam veteran who was dying from cancer. They lived in Minnesota, and he had multiple myeloma that was associated with his exposure to Agent Orange when he was in Hua. And they called me because they had learned about my work through the various press contacts that I had we were one of the few organizations working on this issue actually in the 2000s. But um, she and her husband wanted to have some US government funding go to victims of Agent Orange in Vietnam, because at that point, the US was not providing any support to victims in Vietnam. So they contacted me, and after Bob, her husband, died, they donated $50,000 that we were able to bring to Vietnam to work with the Vietnam Red Cross to provide direct support to victims of Agent Orange. Um, and that work continues today. It's called the Bob Feldman Fund, if you've looked at my website. But she, um, and at the same time that we were providing direct victim assistance, we were advocating for the US government to really take up their moral responsibility and provide funding for this issue. And thankfully, my senator was Senator Leahy, who has been a strong advocate to address war legacy issues in Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia, starting with the unexploded ordnance issue. And then we meaning my organization, Charles Bailey at the Ford Foundation, the Vietnam Veterans of America Foundation, and many other organizations that had been advocating the U.S. to finally address the impacts of Agent Orange in Vietnam. There was a group of probably, I don't know, 5 or 10 individuals and organizations who were really advocating on this issue in the 2000s and or early 2000s. And we finally were able to well, it's a long, really, that story is long
Yes.
and complicated and painful
I know.
about how we finally got the US government to address this issue. But finally, over time, all of us working together kind of developed this similar message of it's a humanitarian problem that the US government really needs to address, that they've got to stop. I mean, once a lawsuit was settled was thrown out of court, it made it a little bit easier to address the issue. But all of the attention that the lawsuit brought to the issue really made it difficult for the U.S. government to ignore it, because there was so much press in Vietnam. There was so much outrage amongst the citizens of Vietnam. Outrage may be a little too strong, but concern, I should say, among the Vietnamese citizens, that the U.S. really, really had no option, really, than to finally start to work on this issue, starting with the dioxin contamination at the hotspots. And then, thanks to Senator Leahy, he always made sure that the human impacts were also addressed in the U.S. funding that he allocated. So that's sort of how I got deeply involved in the issue over time.
Very nice. Well, thank you for the very detailed explanation. I wrote a few questions down on my notepad here, and you, like magic, answered them one by one after the other. But I did manage to write one down that I did wanted to ask you. So I wanted to ask you about the challenges that you faced as an American coming at this from and dealing with American companies and the American government. I wanted to ask you about the roadblocks that you faced since you began this fight in the 90s, and all throughout here into the
Mm-hmm.
2020s. What were those roadblocks like? Was it majority of it top down, like you talked about with Monsanto and the American government not taking responsibility? What I'd like to hear that from you.
Yeah, there were tremendous roadblocks. Um, that I mean, now I look back, 20 plus years now. It's kind of, I mean, I was just up in Burlington, Vermont at a conference day before, with Senator Leahy. It was of his um, kind of work on war legacy issues. And we were all talking about how, pretty amazing what has happened in the last 20 years on this issue, because the US government had their heels really dug in. They did not, I mean, the unexploded ordnance issue, they had been working on since the mid. And again, thanks to Senator Leahy, who was able to bring funding into the issue. But when it comes to unexploded ordnance, there's no question who's responsible for that. I mean, it was dropped by the Americans, these bombs and cluster munitions is about, is quite high, up to 30, sometimes 40%. So it's, the US could easily take full responsibility for that failure rate that was causing injury and harm 50, 30, 40, 50 years later. But when it came to Agent Orange, the science is really, I don't know if you had a chance to look sort of at the science of this, but the science of dioxin, it's not like it's an easily, you get exposed, you get cancer, or you have a child with a birth defect. It's kind of like people who smoke their whole lives and never get cancer, right? And people who don't smoke at all and then get, lung cancer. But so there's no direct correlation. It's science and the animal studies show that clearly exposure to dioxin cause all types of birth defects and all types of cancers. But when it comes to a human being, it's really hard to say your birth defect is a direct result to Agent Orange. And so the US used that sort of scientific cloudiness as an excuse not to do anything. Because they would say, well, we can't prove that this birth defect is caused by our use of Agent Orange 50 years ago or 40 years ago or whenever it was. And they also, the US government was very concerned about the legal issues, the legal responsibility for the use of these herbicides and the long-term impact. Honestly, they really didn't need to be concerned because it's really, really difficult to sue the US government. I mean, almost impossible to sue the US government. They have to agree to be sued, first of all. And as the veterans showed, in their first lawsuit, in the where they won finally a settlement out of court, that was very political that they won, because they knew at the time, the chemical companies knew they would probably lose the case. So it was in their best interest to settle out of court. But all of the new cases that came about post that, was it the 1984? I forget the date of the settlement, but I think it was 1984. Post that first lawsuit settlement, every single case was thrown out of court by the various levels of courts across the U.S. because the chemical companies were given the same immunity that the U.S. government has to lawsuit. So they were determined by the U.S. courts to be government contractors. If you can't sue the U.S. government, you cannot sue government contractors. So they kind of had this little get out of jail free card, right? Or get out of legal responsibility free card. And that was the same reason that the Vietnam victims of the Agent Orange lawsuit was thrown out of court as well, is that the chemical companies had legal immunity, even though it was a little bit more complicated because they were foreigners, filing against in U.S. courts. And there was a few other complicated issues with that lawsuit. But the basic thing was chemical companies were not responsible, and the U.S. government was not responsible because they have, immunity. So there should not have been a legal sort of hesitation, by the Americans government to not address the human side of things or even the environmental side of things when it comes to Agent Orange. But there was, they really was a lot of concerns about what the precedent would be. And especially because you have to remember the U.S. military is in, I don't know the exact number right now, but over 180 countries around the world, they have a military presence. And we have military bases everywhere. And military operations in general are very toxic because you have, particularly when you're talking about air bases where you have these jet fuels and you have, fire retardants, chemicals, and burn pits. And, it's just a very, very toxic industry, the military. So they were really concerned that the government was concerned it would set a precedent for having to clean up other potential hotspots around the world where the U.S. military had been engaged. So there was a lot of really, for many, many, many years, up until about 2006, even beyond 2006, the U.S. Embassy would not talk about the Agent Orange issue with organizations like myself, with the Vietnamese. They were having behind the scenes, the Vietnamese raised it constantly, but there was no way that the two countries were not seeing eye to eye. And we were told, me and other advocates on this issue, that we were making it up or being too extreme when we described the impacts of Agent Orange, that we were listening to Vietnamese government propaganda about the impacts. So it was just this miscommunication and just years and years of non-productive dialogue on the issue, to put it that way, if not complete denial by many in the U.S. government. So it was really, really, really difficult, particularly up until about 2006, 2007. But one of the things that helped kind of break through that problem of inability to communicate was that the Vietnamese Committee 33, which was the committee responsible for investigating the long-term health and environmental impacts of Agent Orange, and before that it was the 1080 Committee, who was really focused on the human impacts.
Right.
They had been working with an organization, or it's a for-profit environmental firm in Canada called Hatfield Consultants. And you may have, if you've done some of your research, you may have come across Hatfield. But Hatfield and 1080 Committee and Committee 33 are the group that tried to answer the question, I should say, about whether or not the areas of Agent Orange where Agent Orange was sprayed in Vietnam were still contaminated today. Or this was in the 90s, mid to late 90s. So in the 90s. Was there still a problem where all the spraying took place? Because the Vietnamese government themselves were concerned about this, because they didn't want people to think that all of their produce and their fish and their export products were contaminated by Agent Orange. So there was concern on both sides about this issue. But Hatfield and their Vietnamese counterparts in their research found that only the areas where the barrels were stored on military bases have a hotspot problem today. And that enabled the US government and the Vietnamese government to finally find common ground, that they could, even though there was still a lot of concern in the US government about taking responsibility for a base that they left at that point 40 something years ago, they at least had a manageable issue. They knew it was limited to just a handful of bases. and that there's a solution to that. Unlike the human side, which is long-term, the dioxin content, it's a Superfund site. You go in there, you find the technology, you clean it up, and problem's over. Very expensive problem, but the problem is manageable. So that enabled the two countries to finally be able to have common ground on the Agent Orange issue where they could work together. And that's, again, where Senator Leahy comes in. He put in the spending bill funding for that project, and that's continued over the last 20 plus years now to address that. But the human side still took a lot of time to get the US to, I mean, they still haven't really admitted that Agent Orange causes these birth defects and disabilities, though they no longer refuse to talk about Agent Orange having health impacts. And they're even now, but that it took years to get them to that point. When Leahy first allocated the funding, the USAID did everything to drag their feet to address it. It took them 2 years to determine how they were going to spend that money. And then when they did, they said, we're just going to use it for disabilities regardless of cause. It was not targeted at the target group that all of our advocates had been working on, which was to get it to people impacted by Agent Orange. And then it took almost another 10 years of working with Senator Leahy's office to get the language in the spending bill to be more targeted to people with severe disabilities in areas where Agent Orange was sprayed. And they didn't just put that language in the bill. It took Charles Bailey at the Ford Foundation, the work I was doing, the work the Vietnam Veterans of America Foundation were doing, and others to try to get a better understanding of who was a victim of Agent Orange, what their disabilities were like, where did they live, and so it was just really kind of like targeting the funding that was coming from the U.S. government to address those who have these serious disabilities, which are the people that the Vietnamese, when they mention who they believe is a victim of Agent Orange, it's those with severe cognitive, physical disabilities that are in very dire situations. They're not the person who, and it gets kind of tough because you don't want to compare one disabled person with a disability against another person with a disability. You want to help everyone, but when we were talking about people who were impacted by Agent Orange, we were talking about those with very severe conditions, not the child who was born blind or deaf or with a mild disability. It was really, we're trying to target the U.S. resources that were finally coming into this issue to those severely impacted. But it took, God, so long at times. It just felt like we would never, ever get there because there was a lot of it was, again, denial from the U.S. Embassy that Agent Orange could cause these problems. And also, you could understand to some point, they're challenging for them as well, because we were, with this targeted funding at people with disability, once we got it targeted, then you are leaving out the other people who had disabilities that may not be Agent Orange related. So it's really it's very complicated in a lot of ways. But so yeah, there are a lot of challenges. But thankfully, I don't think we really would get to where we are today if it wasn't for Senator Leahy, who really believed in addressing this issue and had seniority in the Senate and and Tim Reeser, his staff person, who could work their magic in Congress on these spending bills, because we always call it, decimal dust when it comes to the gigantic American budget. We were talking of, it's like $30 million a year for disability issues, and I think we're at 40 million a year for the cleanup. Sounds enormous to me, but when it comes to our gigantic budget, particularly compared to the Pentagon budget, it's really, really tiny amount of money. But thankfully, we had Senator Leahy as a champion on this issue, and Tim really, who could just convince his colleagues as they were negotiating the foreign operations budget to keep the Agent Orange money in there. We had no problem on the Vietnamese side, of course, because they wanted to help, but a lot of political maneuvering in Washington to make sure that it stayed in the budget.
Well, first off, I wanted to say I can tell that you lead this organization because that was very comprehensive. And there was, I could tell that there were some moments where the memories just came flooding back, like, oh my God, I had to overcome this guy that was telling me all of this BS. This,
I'll tell you one story about that. I was talking about it the other day too, and that 2005, I brought a delegation to Vietnam of anti-war activists. You know, it was for the 2005. It was, so it would have been the 35th anniversary of the end of the war, and we went to the U.S. Embassy and met with the political affairs officer, not political, the public affairs officer at the time, and I can't remember what his name is, but anyway, we were there, and one of my the delegations asked the question, you know, when is the U.S. going to do something about the Agent Orange issue? And this guy nearly slammed his fist on the table. He got really, really, really angry. And he said, I wish people would stop raising this issue of Agent Orange. Because he really believed it was all Vietnamese propaganda. I wish the Vietnamese and you would talk about the good things we did for this country. And we're saying, what do you mean? Well, during the war, he said, we built Tonsonet Airport and we built Highway 1. And he went on these other things that the Americans built during the war, which is true. They did for the war effort.
Right.
And they did do all of these, you know, but I was just like, so you want us to thank you for holding a war and building an airport so you could bring in your military equipment and personnel. And I don't think the Vietnamese really want to thank you for that. I think the Vietnamese would rather have their 3 million people back. And I think the Vietnamese would rather not have the long-term health and environmental impacts, not only of Agent Orange, but the unexploded ordnance you left behind. But it was just that's how far away the two sides, you know, us advocates on the Agent Orange issue and the U.S. Embassy were, even in 2005. It was just mind-boggling that a public affairs, a diplomat at the U.S. Embassy would yell at peace activists for raising the issue of Agent Orange and telling peace activists that they should be grateful that the airport they landed in was built by the Americans during the war. It was just mind-boggling.
Well, I have one last question that I wanted to ask you, and then I want to hand it over to Ben. So I wanted to especially bring it back to, let's talk about something positive, successes. So what I wanted to ask is, we've been talking about the government this whole time, you know, the upper echelon. I wanted to talk about your average John Doe here in America. Whenever you bring up Vietnam, maybe you might get, oh, I love banh mi. I heard that there's great surfing over there. But the majority of the time, you're going to get that image of like, you know, back in the war, fortunate son playing over a helicopter, going over the jungle. What kind of successes have you seen kind of getting that more stereotypical image out, and more so getting the average Joe to realize what Agent Orange is, and reconsidering our war in Vietnam? What have been some successes that you've witnessed?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I think we have made a ton of progress lately, and I think a lot of that, I think you can give credit to the Vietnamese American community who are in the community, I mean, in all communities across the US right now. I mean, unfortunately, not mine. I have to go an hour south to get to a decent Vietnamese restaurant, but I do live in Vermont after all. But I think you can give a lot of credit to the Vietnamese American community for really, and it took years and years and years and years for them to get to this place because, like you said, the image has been um, Vietnam is a war and only a war, not Vietnam was a country, a beautiful country. And when everyone's, like you said, the only war films or the films about Vietnam have been very one-sided war films, where the Vietnamese were if they played any part in the movie, it was they're the ones shooting the Americans. Um, there was no humanity to them. I mean, they didn't even have lines in the film. So it took a lot to, and I blame a lot of the Rambo films that sort of came out under the Reagan era and the MIA myth of the MIA POWs, I should say, that people believe that for many, many, many years, up until the probably mid 90s, that Vietnamese were holding Americans as prisoners of war. Mm-hmm. And that made it really, really challenging for anyone to think about Vietnam other than it being a war that we lost terribly. And I know it's so successful. Certainly. Yeah, I was going to say, you really have to credit the Vietnamese American community for that, for just being very productive, smart, talented members of the American society that people meet. Usually people change their minds when they meet someone. It's harder to counterbalance popular culture, particularly in our media culture. But and people traveling, of course, who were able to, once the trade embargo ended and it was possible to travel to Vietnam, lots of people would travel. Anthony Bourdain, people would watch his show, and that's where they really learned about pho and all the other great cuisine. But yeah.
Yes. Thank you so much for sharing. We really appreciate the insights. And one of our cohort teams are working on Vietnam War in movies, and I would definitely, after we're done with the website and everything, I would definitely be happy to, share with you more about the other groups
Yeah, that would be great. I hope they're talking to Viet Thanh Nguyen, because he really has done a lot of interesting writing on that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yes. So I think I'm gonna have my last question would be, so we talk about a lot of, the efforts of NGOs and international organizations, also the government, in addressing the consequences of Agent Orange. But we also noticed that there seems to be a lack of awareness amongst the young generation, especially, I would say, more from the US side, because the Agent Orange impact is more pronounced in Vietnam. And we got to know about Agent Orange really early on during, our primary school and middle school, where we, got to visit the villages of the descendants of Vietnamese soldiers who are suffering from the pains caused by Agent Orange. So my question would be, how can we, educate the younger generations in the United States about the impact of Agent Orange?
Yeah, that's another good question. I mean, I don't even think the younger generation maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but even really study the Vietnam War in high school or junior high. I mean, it used to be that, I mean, I was too close to the war in my education to study it because it was just over a couple of years before I graduated. But history classes, unless you have a professor or teacher who's really, um, interested in the topic, you tend to go through, you start with the, Revolutionary War and the Civil War and the War of 1812 and First War, Second War, Korean War. And by the time you get to your senior year, you may have a week or two, if most, for the Vietnam War in your curriculum left. Maybe that's changed, but in the past many years, that was the case. And so then coming to the very specific issue of Agent Orange, barely even gets a mention. In fact, when Ken Burns did his film, I don't know if you saw his PBS documentary series on Vietnam, I counted in 18 hours how much he mentioned, not just Agent Orange, but war legacies and issue in general, unexploded ordnance and Agent Orange. 1 minute out of 18 hours was focused on the Agent Orange issue. So it's really, really, really challenging to raise that. And unless you have at this point, it wouldn't even be your father. If you were a young person, it would be your grandfather who would potentially have been the one who served in the Vietnam War. Maybe even great-grandfather in some cases. But so there's very little direct connection in families, young people today with the Vietnam War, maybe your grandfather. And like many, many veterans, they do not talk about the Vietnam War to their family members. My father never talked to me. Unless you actually go and ask, they probably weren't something that they would talk about. But I think one thing that's kind of helped is that there has been a lot more attention today due to the PACT Act that was passed a little while ago, last year, for the burn pits, the Iraq veterans whose health was impacted. And it also addresses the health of the Agent Orange, some of the Vietnam veterans impacted by Agent Orange. That has started to, I think, raise a little bit of awareness in the general public. But yeah, I think educating young people about it, I think you really have to make that connection, a personal connection, or integrate it into other parts of the curriculum. When it just comes, I think young people these days are pretty well educated when it comes to things like, you don't really want to use a lot of fertilizers. You don't want to use a lot of pesticides. You want to use, Roundup is a pretty bad stuff that you want to kind of stay away from. And so maybe connecting it to environmental toxins in our own environment, because Agent Orange is sort of like the prime example of what not to do, and we have, so you really have to, I think, connect it directly to people's lives here to make that, understanding of what these chemicals can do, or connecting it to things like, just the military, responsibility of the U.S. government for their actions in war, unseen consequences. Because, I mean, one of the sad things about the Agent Orange issue is the U.S. government at the time they were using it, I do not believe really knew how dangerous it was. The chemical companies knew, but the U.S. military themselves really did not know. But so it's something that shouldn't have been so politically difficult to address, because it was an unintended consequences of their action. Well, I mean, the actual use of the herbicides was not unintended, but the long-term health and environmental impacts was unintended. And so I think that you can educate people by raising that discussion of what, the unintended consequences, or even what, there's this thing in the scientific world called it's the, I don't know, I'll have to think of the name of it exactly, but it's the precautionary principle.
Mhm.
So if a company creates something that they do not know they do not know the impacts of it right away, but they created it. So therefore, they need to be responsible for the long-term impacts of that. And I think we need to sort of bring that into foreign policy and our engagement in wars, is that we need to talk just specifically about Agent Orange, but Agent Orange is an example of your responsibility for your actions don't end the minute you drop something or the minute you do it, that you have to look downstream, the long-term consequences. So the consequences of taking responsibility for the veterans you send overseas that are then either exposed to burn pits or Agent Orange or other toxics, or the impacts you cause during your war actions on the communities that you're bombing or spraying, that you can't just walk away, that, you're responsible. So I think you have to bring it into a larger sort of context than just the specifics of Agent Orange.
Yes. Thank you so much. I think we have a few minutes left. I'm gonna share with you our website, and
Mm-hmm.
would like to ask for your recommendation and advice on how we can improve it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Let me share my screen.
There we go.
Okay.
Unseen Scars. Oh, that's a great title.
Yes.
Yes.
Oh no, did I do
Mhm.
something? Hold on. Here. Yes, so the group name is Unseen Scars, and it says a pretty Vietnamese translation as well, because
Mhm.
I think we have talked with Paul Cox and
Mhm.
Charles Bailey regarding their recommendations on the playlist of songs that we wanted to add, and that like capture some emotion and experience surrounding Agent Orange. But as you mentioned about the movies, I think if we can find any additionals like movies, we would love to add it to the website as well.
Yeah, there's quite a few films on this topic. Actually, I mean, many of them I actually helped work on, but um, People versus Agent Orange, The Last Ghost of War. I can, if you don't have a list, I can give you a list. Charles may have given you a list, but I have also a lot.
That would
Um,
be great.
and then of course, Orange Crush by REM is about Agent Orange.
Yes. We have a page dedicated to Agent Orange, just some essential facts and legacy. So this was based on one of the project at by Dr. Oh my God. Oh, why did I keep okay. Dr. Diane Fox, who
Yep.
yes. So she taught at the College of Holy Cross, and we did use some of the materials for this.
Yeah. And have you had a chance to talk to her yet or not yet?
Yes, I reached out to her, and we are going to meet with her perhaps next weekend.
Okay, good.
And we have another page for reflection, where we have some of the books here about the Vietnam War and also Agent Orange. And I think last but not least, we have the timeline of justice. We feature the efforts that have been done by NGOs and the two governments international organizations as well.
Good, good, good.
Yes, I think, and the main thing is our conversations. So we have had conversations with the Vietnamese civilians who got exposed to Agent Orange, and the conversations with you and other advocates, as well as U.S. veterans who got cancer related to Agent Orange. So that would be under the project, which is still hasn't been complete, hasn't been
Mhm.
completed. And so here, this is Fan Zung. He's our mentor for this project. I think his dissertation is also on Agent Orange. And
I'm sorry, who was that?
Fan Zung.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, he has I think he's doing his PhD and
In Singapore?
yes, and the
Yeah.
dissertation is on Agent Orange.
Yep.
And Dr. Andrew, Doug, and Jenny and Dr. Huang as well. So they've been our advisors and our team. So this page, this entire website was created by Nam, who he had a cold today, so he cannot join us, but he's been completing everything, which is amazing work. So I just wanted to shout out to Nam
Right.
and me and Lake here. Justin is another team member. Who has been working on research, and we have and Iya will also be in DC, so for the annual dialogue, and we would love to talk
Oh,
with
she
you.
will. Oh, good. Yeah, I haven't met
Yes.
her, even though I'm working with her on another project. So
Oh, awesome.
yeah,
That's great. Yeah, she mentioned you in our
yeah,
conversation. So
yeah.
and Hoa, she unfortunately had to withdraw from the project, but she has also helped us with the proposal during the early stages of the project. She's currently based in Vietnam.
Yep.
Yep. So that's us. And I would love to ask if you have any additional advice for us or anything that you would love to see on the website.
No, I think it'll be very interesting to see that. I mean, there's a lot of documents. I'm sure you'll do a lot of links to other sites. I mean, we've got a website that we built called Agent Orange Record. Needs some updating, but that kind of gives an overview and the history of the issue. And then there's another link to a website that might be good is the Hatfield website where they have all of their documents. And then, of course, I'm sure Charles mentioned the Aspen Institute website, so some of the links to other sites. Another one is Jeannie Stellman's website. I don't know if you have hers. Jeannie, she did the article in Nature magazine where she really looked at the question of how much dioxin was in the herbicides that were sprayed and looked at the spray record. She really went into detail on the ranch hand spray records to identify, how much, get a good final estimate of how much was sprayed. And I'll send you the link to her website because it's not easy to find, but like you can go in there and you can like put in a location and it'll show you the spray records near that location. She used to be at Columbia University. She's now more or less retired, but so she has some good resources on her website too, particularly for veterans. Her website was really targeted for veterans. The other is, I don't know if you're also talking to children of Vietnam veterans and their struggles to get their health issues concerned and their health concerns addressed. There used to be a pretty well-organized group called Children of Vietnam Veterans Health Alliance, though that group kind of fell apart over time, but they do have a website, a Facebook presence still, but they did a lot of advocacy work on this issue to try to get their concerns addressed by the Veterans Administration. And Heather Bowser is one of the founders of that organization. She might be good to talk to too when it comes to the children of Vietnam veterans. And then, of course, the other kind of missing piece to this issue is the Vietnamese Americans and the Lao Americans, the Hmong Americans who may have been impacted. And it's really challenging to penetrate that question, because it used to be that it was Vietnamese Americans would tell me that they did not want to raise the issue of Agent Orange. This is pretty much before the US government was getting too close to the issue and involved with the issue in Vietnam. But they were really afraid that if they complained that their health may have been compromised by Agent Orange or the war in general, that they could lose their citizenship or their health benefits, or if they were on Medicaid or Medicare, or they did not want to raise this issue. Or many of them also just believed it was North Vietnamese government, the current government of Vietnam's propaganda. And they believe that strongly, some of them. So it's been really challenging to try to get a sense of how many Vietnamese Americans or Lao or Hmong Americans who were also exposed may have disabilities in their families that could be associated to Agent Orange, or cancers or other conditions. So that's kind of another missing, unanswered question when it comes to this issue.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thank you so much. I think that would conclude our conversation today. I would love to meet you in DC next week. And
yes, we'll see you in DC. Yeah.
Yes.
See you too. Thank you so much, Susan.
Yep.
This has been
You're welcome.
really great.
All right. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. You too.
Yeah, have a good weekend. We'll see you Wednesday. I think it's Wednesday or Thursday. I forget which day it is.
Thursday. Yeah, Thursday and
Thursday.
Friday.
Great. All right. Super. Thanks.
See you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.